The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valdoria Palace, as Captain Marcus Thorne made his routine rounds through the East Wing. As the head of the Royal Guard, he had served the Kingdom of Valdoria for 15 years, witnessing 3 different monarchs rise to power. But nothing had prepared him for what he would discover on this seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning. King Edmund Blackwater had ruled Valdoria for only 2 years since his older brother's unexpected death, and the transition had been far from smooth. The kingdom faced economic challenges, political unrest, and questions about the new king's legitimacy. Many nobles still whispered that Edmund's rise to power had been too convenient, too perfectly timed. Queen Isabel Blackwater, formerly a duchess from the neighboring kingdom of Astoria, had married Edmund just 6 months after his coronation. Their union was meant to strengthen diplomatic ties and bring stability to both kingdoms. She was known for her intelligence, her charitable work, and her ability to charm foreign dignitaries. The people loved her more than they loved their king. Captain Thorne paused outside the Queen's private study, hearing voices inside. Protocol dictated that he should announce his presence, but something about the hushed, urgent tone made him hesitate. Through the slightly open door, he could see Queen Isabel speaking with Lord Chancellor Vincent Ashford, one of the king's most trusted advisors. The Queen's voice was different from her usual melodious tone that graced public appearances. There was steel in it, calculation that sent a chill down Thorne's spine. She was discussing something about removing obstacles and ensuring the kingdom's future. Lord Ashford nodded gravely, mentioning documents that needed to be secured and allies who needed to be contacted. Thorne's hand instinctively moved to the recording device on his belt, a small gadget that all guards carried for security purposes. Before he could think twice about the consequences, he pressed the record button. What he heard next would change everything he thought he knew about the royal family. Queen Isabel spoke of King Edmund's unfitness to rule and his dangerous decisions that threatened the kingdom's survival. She mentioned medical reports that had been altered, meetings with foreign ambassadors that the king knew nothing about, and a plan that had been months in the making. Lord Ashford discussed timing, mentioning that the upcoming harvest festival would provide the perfect cover for their next moves. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes, during which Thorne remained frozen outside the door. They discussed contingency plans, financial arrangements with noble houses, and something called the Astoria Solution. The Queen's voice carried an authority that made it clear she was not just participating in this plan, she was leading it. When the meeting concluded, Thorne quickly moved away from the door, his mind racing. He had recorded evidence of what appeared to be a conspiracy against the king, led by his own wife. As he walked through the palace corridors, everything looked different now. The servants seemed to avoid eye contact. The nobles clustered in small groups, whispering urgently when they thought no one was listening. That evening, Thorne found himself alone in his quarters, staring at the recording device. He had sworn an oath to protect the crown, but which crown was he supposed to protect? The king who seemed increasingly isolated and paranoid, or the queen who appeared to be orchestrating his downfall? The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force. He thought about his family, his career, his loyalty to the kingdom itself. If he reported what he had heard, it would tear the royal family apart and potentially destabilize the entire kingdom. If he remained silent, he would be complicit in whatever Queen Isabel and her conspirators had planned. As midnight approached, Captain Thorne made a decision that would change the course of Valdoria's history. He couldn't keep this secret, but he also couldn't simply hand it over to the king without understanding the full scope of the conspiracy. He needed to investigate further, to understand who else was involved and what exactly they were planning. The next morning, Thorne began his own careful investigation. He started paying closer attention to the patterns of movement within the palace, noting which nobles met with whom and when. He observed the Queen's daily routine more carefully, tracking her meetings and correspondences. What he discovered over the following days painted a picture of a conspiracy that reached far deeper into the kingdom's power structure than he had initially imagined. 3 days after his shocking discovery, Captain Thorne had gathered enough evidence to understand that Queen Isabel's conspiracy involved at least 6 high-ranking nobles, 3 foreign ambassadors, and possibly members of the royal council itself. The web of deception was far more extensive than he had initially feared. During his investigation, Thorne discovered that several key documents had been removed from the royal archives, including detailed financial records and correspondence with neighboring kingdoms. The palace's head librarian, an elderly woman named Margaret who had served the crown for 30 years, confided in him that she had been ordered to restrict access to certain historical documents about succession laws. The captain also noticed changes in the palace staff's behavior. Servants who had once moved freely through all areas of the palace were now limited to specific sections. New guards had been hired, men whose loyalty seemed to lie more with Lord Ashford than with the traditional chain of command. These guards wore the same uniform but carried themselves differently, with the confidence of soldiers who knew they served a different master. King Edmund himself appeared increasingly isolated. Thorne observed that the king's meals were now prepared by a select group of kitchen staff, and his personal physician had been replaced just 2 weeks earlier. The king's daily schedule had been altered to limit his contact with certain nobles and foreign dignitaries. Most telling of all, the king's traditional weekly meetings with the common people had been cancelled indefinitely, officially due to security concerns. Queen Isabel, meanwhile, had increased her public appearances. She visited orphanages, attended charity events, and held court with foreign dignitaries. The people adored her, seeing her as a breath of fresh air compared to the increasingly reclusive king. Local newspapers praised her grace and intelligence, often contrasting her visible leadership with the king's apparent withdrawal from public life. Thorne's investigation led him to a disturbing discovery in the palace's medical wing. The royal physician's notes, which he managed to glimpse during a security inspection, contained references to the king's declining mental state and episodes of paranoia. However, Thorne had observed the king personally and had seen no evidence of such symptoms. The king appeared stressed and tired, certainly, but his mind seemed as sharp as ever. The captain realized that Queen Isabel and her allies were carefully crafting a narrative that would justify their actions. They were building a case that King Edmund was unfit to rule, creating documentation that would support their claims should they need to defend their conspiracy publicly. The medical reports, the restricted access, the changed personnel, all of it was designed to create the appearance of a king losing his grip on reality and power. On Friday evening, exactly 1 week after his initial discovery, Thorne made a decision that would set everything in motion. He couldn't continue to watch this conspiracy unfold without acting, but he also couldn't simply approach the king directly. Too many people in the palace were now suspect, and he didn't know who could be trusted. Instead, he chose to contact Lady Sarah Brightwater, the king's cousin and one of the few nobles who had remained consistently loyal to King Edmund. Lady Sarah had a reputation for integrity and had often spoken publicly about the importance of legitimate succession and royal duty. More importantly, she had been notably absent from any of the suspicious meetings Thorne had observed. The meeting took place in the palace gardens, during the evening patrol route that Thorne walked every night. Lady Sarah listened in stunned silence as he played portions of the recording and shared his observations from the past week. Her face grew pale as she realized the implications of what she was hearing. Lady Sarah revealed that she had suspected something was amiss, but had attributed the strange behavior to the natural tensions of a new reign. She had noticed that several nobles who had once opposed Queen Isabel's marriage to the king had suddenly become her strongest supporters. She had also wondered about the timing of various policy changes that seemed to favor Astoria's interests over Valdoria's traditional allies. Together, they developed a plan to gather more concrete evidence before approaching the king. Lady Sarah would use her position to access certain financial records and correspondence that Thorne couldn't reach. She would also carefully sound out other nobles to determine the full extent of the conspiracy and identify potential allies. Thorne would continue his surveillance, but would also begin documenting everything he observed, creating a comprehensive record of the conspiracy's activities. They agreed to meet again in 3 days to share their findings and decide on their next course of action. As they parted ways in the moonlit garden, both understood that they were now committed to a dangerous path. If Queen Isabel discovered their investigation, the consequences would be severe. But the alternative, allowing the conspiracy to succeed, would mean the destruction of everything they had sworn to protect. Lady Sarah's investigation over the next 3 days revealed the shocking scope of Queen Isabel's plan. Using her access to the royal treasury records, she discovered that significant amounts of gold had been transferred to accounts controlled by Astorian banks. The transactions were cleverly disguised as payments for various royal projects, but the timing and amount suggested something far more sinister. More disturbing still were the documents she found hidden in Lord Ashford's private office. While attending a reception in the West Wing, Lady Sarah had noticed that the Lord Chancellor's study was unguarded for exactly 15 minutes during the evening patrol change. In that brief window, she discovered correspondence with King Aldrich of Astoria, Queen Isabel's brother, discussing the integration of Valdoria's resources and the transition period following Edmund's abdication. The letters made it clear that this was not simply a plan to remove King Edmund from power, but a calculated scheme to merge Valdoria into the Astorian kingdom. Queen Isabel had been planted as a spy and saboteur, her marriage to Edmund nothing more than a strategic move to position herself for a takeover. The Harvest Festival, now just 2 weeks away, was mentioned repeatedly as the target date for the final phase of their plan. Captain Thorne's continued surveillance had yielded equally disturbing intelligence. He had observed several meetings between Queen Isabel and Captain Roderick Blackthorne of the Queen's Guard, a unit that had been established just months after her arrival. These guards, supposedly created for the Queen's personal protection, were all former Astorian soldiers. Their loyalty was clearly not to Valdoria. Most alarmingly, Thorne had witnessed the arrival of additional guards, who were housed in a section of the palace that had been declared off-limits for renovations. These men were armed and moved with military precision, but they wore no official uniforms and answered only to Captain Blackthorne. Thorne estimated their numbers at around 50, a significant force that could easily overwhelm the traditional palace guard if they acted in coordination. The captain had also discovered that several key members of the Royal Guard had been reassigned to distant posts or had mysteriously fallen ill and been replaced by men recommended by Lord Ashford. The roster of guards loyal to King Edmund was shrinking daily, while those of questionable loyalty were increasing their presence in critical areas of the palace. When Thorne and Lady Sarah met again in the garden, both were shaken by what they had learned. The conspiracy was not just about removing King Edmund, it was about the complete absorption of Valdoria by Astoria. The queen they had welcomed as a symbol of diplomatic unity was actually the advance guard of an invasion. Lady Sarah had also made a crucial discovery about the medical reports claiming King Edmund's mental instability. The royal physician who had been dismissed was Dr. Helena Morse, a woman known for her integrity and loyalty to the crown. Lady Sarah had managed to contact Dr. Morse discreetly and learned that she had been forced to resign after refusing to falsify medical records about the king's condition. Dr. Morse revealed that Queen Isabel had pressured her to document episodes of paranoia and mental instability that had never occurred. When Dr. Morse refused and threatened to report the attempted coercion, she found herself accused of incompetence and dismissed from royal service. Her replacement, Dr. Marcus Fell, had previously served in Astoria and had no qualms about creating the documentation Queen Isabel required. The evidence was now overwhelming, but presenting it to King Edmund posed significant risks. The palace was filled with Isabel's allies and Astorian agents. Any direct approach to the king could result in their discovery and elimination before they could warn him of the danger he faced. Lady Sarah proposed a desperate but necessary solution. They needed to get the evidence to someone outside the palace who could verify its authenticity and help them expose the conspiracy publicly. She suggested her brother, Lord Thomas Brightwater, who served as a judge in the kingdom's highest court and had connections with foreign diplomats who could confirm the Astorian involvement. However, communicating with the outside world would require them to bypass the palace's controlled communication systems. Queen Isabel's allies had systematically gained control over the postal service, the messenger corps, and even the telegraph operators who served the palace. Any official communication would be intercepted and traced back to them. Thorne remembered that his younger brother worked as a blacksmith in the village just outside the palace grounds. During his military service, his brother had learned to read and write and had always been trustworthy. If they could get a message to him during one of Thorne's routine security patrols of the village, he could carry it to Lord Thomas without arousing suspicion. The plan was risky, but seemed to be their only option. They would compile all their evidence into a comprehensive report, including copies of the financial records, transcripts of the recorded conversations, and Dr. Morse's testimony about the falsified medical reports. Lady Sarah would write a letter to her brother explaining the situation and requesting his immediate assistance. As they finalized their plan, both understood that they were running out of time. The harvest festival was approaching rapidly, and the increased activity around the palace suggested that Queen Isabel's final moves were already beginning. They had perhaps a week to expose the conspiracy before it was too late to save both King Edmund and the independence of Valdoria itself. The plan to contact Lord Thomas Brightwater through Captain Thorne's brother should have been straightforward, but nothing in the palace remained simple once Queen Isabel's web of deception was discovered. On the morning Thorne was scheduled to make contact during his village patrol, he found his route had been changed without notice. Captain Blackthorne informed him that new security protocols required all patrols to be conducted in pairs, making covert communication impossible. This sudden change confirmed their worst fears. Someone suspected their activities. Lady Sarah reported that several servants had been asking questions about her recent movements, and she had noticed unfamiliar faces among the staff who seemed more interested in watching the nobles than performing their duties. The conspiracy was tightening its surveillance as the harvest festival approached. Desperate times required desperate measures. Lady Sarah made the dangerous decision to attend the weekly market in the village, something she rarely did but which would not seem entirely out of character, given her reputation for connecting with common people. She would pose as someone interested in purchasing items for the upcoming festival, while actually seeking to make contact with Thorne's brother. The market visit proved both successful and terrifying. Lady Sarah managed to pass a message to the blacksmith, but she also discovered the extent of Queen Isabel's preparation for the festival. Asturian merchants had flooded the market, officially selling goods and crafts but clearly serving as additional eyes and ears. The festival, which had always been a celebration of Valdoria's independence and prosperity, was being systematically infiltrated by foreign agents. More disturbing still, Lady Sarah overheard conversations between these merchants that suggested the festival would be the cover for something they called the final celebration. The timing aligned perfectly with what she and Thorne had learned about Queen Isabel's plans, but the casual way these strangers discussed it suggested the conspiracy reached far beyond the palace walls. Meanwhile, Thorne's situation in the palace was becoming increasingly precarious. He had been reassigned to duties that kept him away from the royal quarters during crucial hours, and his access to sensitive areas had been quietly restricted. When he questioned these changes, he was told they were temporary adjustments for festival security, but the pattern was unmistakable. The captain also noticed that King Edmund himself was showing signs of stress that went beyond normal royal duties. The king had become increasingly isolated, taking his meals alone and avoiding even his most trusted advisors. When Thorne did catch glimpses of him, King Edmund appeared confused and disoriented, as if he was struggling to understand what was happening around him. This observation led Thorne to a chilling realization. Dr. Fell, the new royal physician, had been administering daily treatments to the king for what he claimed were headaches and stress. If Queen Isabel was willing to falsify medical records, she might also be willing to use actual medication to create the symptoms she was documenting. The king's growing confusion might not be natural at all. Lady Sarah's brother, Lord Thomas, proved to be their salvation when he arrived at the palace 3 days later, under the pretense of attending the harvest festival preparations. His official position as a judge gave him legitimate reason to visit, and his reputation for integrity made his presence seem natural rather than suspicious. The reunion between the siblings was carefully orchestrated to appear casual, but Lord Thomas quickly grasped the severity of the situation when Lady Sarah discreetly passed him copies of the evidence they had gathered. His experience with legal documents allowed him to immediately recognize the significance of the financial transfers and forged medical records. Lord Thomas also brought crucial information from outside the palace. He had received reports from other kingdoms about unusual Asturian military movements near their borders. Several nations had noticed increased activity at Astorian training facilities and the movement of supplies that suggested preparation for extended campaigns. The conspiracy against King Edmund was apparently part of a larger Astorian expansion plan. The judge also confirmed that similar patterns had been observed in other kingdoms where Astorian nobility had married into ruling families. In each case, the foreign spouse had gradually isolated their partner from traditional allies while building relationships with Astorian sympathizers. Two smaller kingdoms had already been peacefully absorbed by Astoria through such marriages, their independence dissolved through treaties signed by rulers who had been systematically weakened and manipulated. Armed with this broader context, Lord Thomas agreed to help expose the conspiracy, but he warned that they needed irrefutable proof that would convince not just Valdoria's people, but also foreign allies who might intervene to preserve the kingdom's independence. The evidence they had gathered was compelling but circumstantial. They needed something that would definitively prove Queen Isabel's treasonous intent. The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Helena Morse, the dismissed royal physician, contacted Lord Thomas through mutual acquaintances in the medical community. She had kept detailed notes about her interactions with Queen Isabel and Dr. Fell, including dates, times, and specific requests for falsified documentation. More importantly, she had managed to obtain samples of the medications being administered to King Edmund. Dr. Morse's analysis revealed that the king was being given a combination of drugs that would cause exactly the symptoms described in the falsified medical reports: confusion, memory problems, and emotional instability. The medications were administered in small doses that would be difficult to detect, but would accumulate over time to create increasingly severe symptoms. King Edmund was being slowly poisoned to create justification for his removal from power. With this medical evidence added to their financial and documentary proof, they finally had what they needed to expose the conspiracy. But time was running short. The harvest festival would begin in just 4 days, and they still needed to find a way to safely present their evidence to the king and rally loyal forces to defend the crown. The revelation about King Edmund being slowly poisoned changed everything. Lord Thomas realized they could no longer wait to gather more evidence or plan elaborate strategies. The king's life was in immediate danger, and every day of delay meant further deterioration of his condition and strengthening of Queen Isabel's position. Dr. Morse provided them with an antidote that would counteract the effects of the drugs being administered to the king, but getting it to him required direct access that none of them currently possessed. Thorne's reduced duties meant he rarely came into contact with the king, and Lady Sarah's movements were being monitored too closely for her to approach the royal quarters safely. The solution came from an unexpected ally. Margaret, the elderly head librarian, approached Lady Sarah during what appeared to be a routine visit to the archives. The old woman had observed the strange changes in the palace and had drawn her own conclusions about what was happening. Her decades of service had made her nearly invisible to the conspirators, who saw her as harmless and irrelevant. Margaret revealed that she had maintained a secret network of loyal servants who were disturbed by the changes they witnessed, but had been too frightened to speak out. These servants included a kitchen maid who prepared the king's evening tea, a stable boy who cleaned the royal quarters each morning, and several guards who had been reassigned to less important duties but still moved freely through certain areas of the palace. This network of overlooked palace staff had been carefully documenting the conspiracy's activities, keeping detailed records of who came and went, what orders were given, and how normal routines had been altered. Their observations confirmed much of what Thorne and Lady Sarah had discovered, but also revealed additional details about the timing and scope of Queen Isabel's plans. The kitchen maid, a young woman named Emma, had noticed that Dr. Fell personally supervised the preparation of King Edmund's meals and often added medications directly to his food and drinks. She had been ordered to use specific ingredients and follow exact timing that seemed designed to enhance the absorption of whatever drugs were being administered. Through Margaret's network, they learned that Queen Isabel had scheduled a private dinner with King Edmund for the evening before the harvest festival began. This dinner would take place in the Queen's private chambers, away from the usual protocols and witnesses. The servants had been told to prepare for a very intimate gathering with minimal staff and no guards except for Captain Blackthorn's men. Lord Thomas immediately recognized this dinner as the likely moment for the conspiracy's final move. With the king isolated, drugged, and surrounded only by Isabel's allies, he could be forced to sign documents transferring power or could simply disappear entirely. The festival celebrations would provide perfect cover for announcing his abdication or even his death from natural causes. They had less than 2 days to prevent this outcome. Working through Margaret's network, they developed a desperate plan that relied on the very invisibility that had allowed the servants to observe the conspiracy undetected. Emma would replace the king's usual medications with Dr. Morse's antidote, gradually restoring his mental clarity over the next day. Meanwhile, the stable boy would create an opportunity for Thorne to access the royal quarters by staging a minor emergency that would require the captain's immediate attention. The plan required precise timing and flawless execution. If any element failed, they would all be exposed and eliminated before they could warn the king or summon help. But they also recognized that this might be their only chance to save both King Edmund and the kingdom's independence. Lady Sarah would use the confusion of festival preparations to position herself near the royal quarters, ready to support Thorne when he made his move. Lord Thomas would simultaneously prepare to leave the palace and alert foreign allies about the situation, ensuring that even if their rescue attempt failed, the truth about Queen Isabel's conspiracy would not die with them. As the evening of their planned intervention approached, each member of their small resistance understood that they were risking everything on a single desperate gamble. The palace around them continued its normal routines, but beneath the surface, 2 competing visions of Valdoria's future were preparing for a final confrontation. Queen Isabel spent the day making final preparations for her private dinner with the king, believing that her victory was assured. She had systematically removed every obstacle to her plan and positioned her allies in all crucial locations. The Asturian forces hidden in the palace were ready to move, and the financial arrangements for the kingdom's absorption were complete. But she had underestimated the loyalty and courage of those she considered beneath her notice. The servants, guards, and nobles she had dismissed as irrelevant were about to demonstrate that true power sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources. The forgotten and overlooked were preparing to save their kingdom from the shadows, where they had been forced to operate. The morning of the planned intervention began with unexpected complications. Captain Blackthorne had mysteriously increased security throughout the palace, and several key members of Margaret's servant network found their duties changed or their access restricted. It seemed as though Queen Isabel's allies had detected something, even if they didn't understand the full scope of the resistance forming against them. Emma, the kitchen maid, faced the greatest challenge. Dr. Fell had arrived early to personally oversee the preparation of King Edmund's breakfast, making it impossible for her to replace his medications as planned. The young woman showed remarkable courage by creating a distraction, deliberately dropping a tray of dishes and claiming to have injured her hand. While Dr. Fell attended to her supposed injury, she managed to switch the medications, but the close call left everyone involved terrified that their plan had been discovered. Meanwhile, Thorne found himself assigned to duties in the outer courtyard, far from the royal quarters where he needed to be. The stable boy's planned emergency would be useless if the captain couldn't reach the king's chambers quickly when the opportunity arose. Desperate improvisation became necessary when Lady Sarah volunteered to create a different kind of distraction that would require Thorne's immediate attention in the correct location. The distraction Lady Sarah created was both brilliant and dangerous. She deliberately triggered a minor fire in a storage room near the royal quarters by knocking over an oil lamp while examining tapestries for the festival decorations. The fire was small enough to be contained quickly but serious enough to require immediate response from the guard captain. Protocol demanded that Thorne personally inspect any security threat near the royal family's living areas. As Thorne rushed to respond to the fire, he found King Edmund alone in his study for the first time in weeks. The antidote Emma had administered that morning had already begun to clear the king's mind, and he was struggling to understand why his thoughts felt clearer than they had in months. The confusion in his eyes was heartbreaking, but it also meant he was lucid enough to understand what Thorne was about to tell him. The revelation hit King Edmund like a physical blow. As Thorne quickly explained the conspiracy and showed him copies of the evidence they had gathered, The king's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally a cold determination that reminded everyone present why he had been chosen to rule. The medications had clouded his judgment but had not broken his spirit, and learning the truth about his wife's betrayal awakened something fierce and royal in his demeanor. King Edmund's first instinct was to confront Queen Isabel immediately, but Thorne and Lady Sarah convinced him that surprise was their only advantage. The Queen believed her plan was proceeding perfectly, and revealing their knowledge too early would allow her allies to adapt or escape. Instead, they needed to use the evening's private dinner as an opportunity to gather final evidence and expose the conspiracy in a way that would convince the entire kingdom, Lord. Thomas had spent the day making contact with foreign ambassadors and loyal military commanders outside the palace. His legal expertise had helped him craft documents that would formally charge Queen Isabel and her conspirators with treason, but these charges would only be effective if they could present irrefutable proof of her crimes. The dinner would provide the perfect opportunity to record her confession or catch her in the act of attempting to force the king's abdication. The plan they developed was risky, but elegant in its simplicity. King Edmund would attend the dinner as planned, but he would be secretly protected by Thorne and several loyal guards positioned nearby. Hidden recording devices would capture whatever Queen Isabel said or did, providing the evidence needed to arrest her and her allies. Margaret's servant network would be positioned to prevent escape routes and to witness the Queen's actions. As evening approached, the tension in the palace became almost unbearable. Queen Isabel spent hours preparing for what she believed would be her moment of triumph. She dressed in her finest gown, adorned herself with the crown jewels, and rehearsed the speech she planned to give after King Edmund's forced abdication. Captain Blackthorne and his Asturian soldiers were positioned throughout the palace, ready to take control once their queen gave the signal. But unknown to Queen Isabel, every move she made was being observed and documented by the resistance network that had formed around the king. Emma watched from the kitchens as special foods were prepared for the dinner, foods that Dr. Fell had personally selected and supervised. The stable boy monitored the movements of the suspicious guards who had been positioned near escape routes. Margaret herself stationed herself where she could observe the corridor leading to the Queen's chambers. King Edmund, now fully alert and burning with righteous anger, prepared for what might be the most important performance of his life. He would need to appear weak and confused while actually being completely aware of everything happening around him. The success of their plan depended on Queen Isabel believing that her drugs had made him malleable enough to sign whatever documents she presented. As the sun set over Valdoria Palace, two very different groups prepared for a confrontation that would determine the kingdom's future. Queen Isabel and her conspirators believed they were hours away from completing their takeover, while King Edmund and his loyal defenders prepared to spring a trap that would expose the greatest betrayal in the kingdom's history. The private dinner that was supposed to be Queen Isabel's moment of victory was about to become the scene of her downfall, but only if everything went exactly according to plan. The private dinner began exactly as Queen Isabel had planned, with King Edmund appearing confused and docile as he was escorted to her chambers by Captain Blackthorne's guards. The Queen had arranged the room perfectly for her purposes, with important documents spread across a side table and a special pen prepared for the king's signature. Hidden recording devices, secretly placed by Margaret's network earlier that day, captured every word and gesture. Queen Isabel's performance was masterful in its calculated cruelty. She spoke to King Edmund as if he were a child, explaining how difficult his reign had become and how much the kingdom needed strong leadership. She presented forged medical reports claiming his mental deterioration was irreversible, and argued that stepping down would be the most patriotic thing he could do for Valdoria. But King Edmund's response shocked her completely. Instead of the confused compliance she expected, he looked directly into her eyes with perfect clarity and said, "I know exactly what you've been doing, Isabel. The question is whether you're brave enough to admit it now that your charade is over." The Queen's composure cracked for just a moment before she attempted to maintain her facade, claiming that his paranoia was proof of his unfitness to rule. But King Edmund continued speaking with devastating precision, describing the financial transfers to Astoria, the forged medical records, the hidden soldiers, and the systematic poisoning that had nearly destroyed his mind. Realizing that her deception had been discovered, Queen Isabel abandoned all pretense. Her voice turned cold and calculating as she revealed the full scope of her mission. She was not just King Edmund's wife, but a trained operative sent by her brother, King Aldric of Astoria, to systematically weaken and absorb Valdoria. The marriage had been a tactical maneuver, and every moment of affection she had shown had been carefully crafted manipulation. The Queen's confession was even more damaging than they had hoped. She boasted about how easily she had corrupted Valdoria's nobles with Astorian gold, how simple it had been to replace loyal servants with her own agents, and how the kingdom's independence had been doomed from the moment she arrived. Her arrogance led her to reveal details about similar operations in other kingdoms and future Astorian expansion plans. Captain Blackthorn, who had been standing guard during the dinner, began to look uncomfortable as Queen Isabel's admissions grew more treasonous. Despite his loyalty to Astoria, he was a professional soldier who understood the rules of warfare, and what the Queen was describing sounded more like systematic betrayal than legitimate conquest. The turning point came when Queen Isabel demanded that King Edmund sign documents transferring all royal authority to her as regent, with the understanding that she would eventually cede control to King Aldric. When the king refused, she nodded to Captain Blackthorn, clearly expecting him to use force to compel compliance. Instead, Captain Blackthorn hesitated, and in that moment of uncertainty, Captain Thorne and his loyal guards burst into the room. The recording devices had captured everything they needed, and Lord Thomas was already preparing formal charges based on Queen Isabel's own confession. The trap had worked perfectly. The confrontation that followed was swift but dramatic. Queen Isabel's hidden Astorian soldiers attempted to seize control of the palace, but they found themselves outnumbered by loyal Valdorian forces that Lord Thomas had secretly positioned throughout the building. Margaret's servant network had provided crucial intelligence about enemy positions, allowing the loyal forces to neutralize the threat with minimal casualties. Captain Blackthorn, faced with the choice between continuing a doomed mission or preserving his honor as a soldier, chose to surrender rather than fight a battle he now understood was based on deception rather than legitimate orders. Several of his men followed his example, while others were captured trying to escape. Queen Isabel herself maintained her defiant attitude even as she was placed under arrest. She warned that King Aldric would not accept her failure, and that Astoria would simply find other ways to absorb Valdoria. Her threats carried weight, as everyone understood that exposing her conspiracy might provoke direct military action from the neighboring kingdom. The immediate crisis was resolved, but King Edmund and his advisors knew they faced a larger challenge. The evidence of Queen Isabel's conspiracy needed to be presented to other kingdoms to prevent Astoria from claiming that Valdoria had acted aggressively against a legitimate royal marriage. Lord Thomas's legal expertise proved invaluable in preparing documents that would justify their actions under international law. Dr. Morse's medical evidence about the systematic poisoning became particularly important, as it provided clear proof that Queen Isabel had attempted to murder King Edmund, rather than simply influence his policies. This transformed the situation from a political dispute into a clear case of attempted regicide that even Astoria's allies would find difficult to defend. The Harvest Festival, which had been intended as cover for Queen Isabel's final takeover, instead became a celebration of Valdoria's independence and resilience. King Edmund appeared before his people with a clear mind and strong voice, explaining how close they had come to losing their freedom and praising the courage of those who had saved the kingdom. The loyal servants, guards and nobles who had risked everything to expose the conspiracy, were honored publicly, with Margaret receiving special recognition for her role in coordinating the resistance network. Captain Thorne was promoted and given additional responsibilities for palace security, while Lady Sarah became one of the king's most trusted advisors. Queen Isabel was eventually returned to Astoria as part of a negotiated settlement that avoided open warfare, but included significant concessions from King Aldric regarding future expansion plans. The evidence of her conspiracy was shared with other kingdoms, making it much more difficult for Astoria to repeat such operations elsewhere. King Edmund's reign was strengthened by the crisis, as his people had seen both his vulnerability and his courage. The experience taught the kingdom valuable lessons about the price of freedom and the importance of remaining vigilant against those who would destroy it from within. Valdoria's independence had been preserved, but at a cost that reminded everyone that liberty must be constantly defended by those brave enough to stand against deception and betrayal.